My sister, Karen, found it hilarious when the kids playfully shoved the guests into the pool, and to my surprise, she pointed the finger at me for their antics. My sister, Lisa, chuckled as the children playfully pushed guests into the pool, then turned to me, claiming I was dodging their attempts to shove me in while they fell in themselves. This all unfolded today when my parents decided to host a barbecue, which seems to be a common pastime for older folks. I opted out initially because I have never been fond of my two sisters, their husbands, or their kids. My wife and I are child-free, and my mom pressured my wife to come along. Long story short, we ended up going. By the time we arrived, there were about 20 people gathered. My sisters and their husbands were already quite tipsy, and my mom was fully occupied trying to keep the kids, aged 7 to 11, somewhat under control. My dad had strategically retreated to the hot tub area with a small cooler filled with beers. My wife and I made small talk with various guests, enjoyed some food, and sipped on frozen margaritas. My sisters and their husbands took turns criticizing us for being late, not wearing swimsuits, and ruining the vibe, just the usual suburban summer gathering drama. About 45 minutes in, two of the kids sprinted toward one of the neighbor guests standing by the pool and pushed her in. She stumbled into the pool steps but managed to stay upright, only getting partially wet. Clearly unhappy, she didn't make a scene. Instead, she walked over to the parents, grabbed a towel, dried off, and left. My sisters and their husbands found the whole situation hilarious. A little later, while I was chatting a few feet away from the pool, I noticed three kids charging toward me from the corner of my eye. It was obvious I was their next target. Not that it's hard to predict the antics of young kids, but I managed to jump out of their way just in time. All three of them dove straight into the pool at full speed. Most of the other guests, including my wife and me, burst into laughter, but their mothers, who were quite inebriated, completely panicked. Apparently, two of the kids couldn't swim, despite being in swimsuits. Since I wasn't in swim gear, I stepped back from the pool and let others handle the situation. The kids were wailing as if they had lost a limb, and chaos erupted. The four intoxicated parents began yelling at everyone, particularly me, for nearly letting their kids drown. To make matters worse, two of the kids had been filming the whole stunt on their parents' iPhones, which were now at the bottom of the pool. One of the husbands jumped into the pool to try to retrieve the phones, but his size and back issues made it impossible. No one else volunteered to help, unsurprisingly, as my sisters were still berating everyone. I told my sisters it was their responsibility to watch their kids, and if anything had happened, it would have been on them, not me. Tensions flared, and some pretty harsh words were exchanged. My wife and I decided to leave after one of the husbands tripped and faceplanted while yelling at us. Now they're saying I should have just let the kids push me into the pool and ruin my phone for their amusement. As a side note, my dad, of course, never left the hot tub. The consensus was that I was not at fault. In an update, I shared that the kids were fully capable of swimming and that the party ended on a sour note. It turned out that the husband who fell had to get stitches. My sisters and their husbands texted me nasty messages, which led my wife and me to block them. My parents were furious about the texts and made my sisters apologize, hoping to end the drama. I thought that would be the end of it, but then I received a text from one of the husbands demanding that I reimburse them for the phone. I refused and sent a screenshot of the message to my parents, stating that I was going no contact with my sisters. This was out of character for me, but my dad called my sisters and gave them a piece of his mind. He told them that their kids were no longer welcome at their house indefinitely, which disrupted the free babysitting my mom usually provided. They were also banned from the vacation home, and my dad made it clear that I owned that property, not them. My sisters freaked out and showed up unannounced a few days later to apologize. My wife and I were out at dinner, so they left a note. I decided that no contact was the best option for now. In another update, I mentioned that the last few days had been quite eventful. I thought things had hit rock bottom before, but it turned out to be just the beginning. My sisters believed our parents were wealthy, but in reality, they were not. It came to light that my oldest sister and her family had been living beyond their means and were in need of a loan. My brother-in-law, Mark, and his partner, Jake, have been relentless in their attempts to reach me, leaving messages through Google Voice, demanding that I meet with them to discuss how everyone can use the family vacation home. I have chosen not to respond, and I have no intention of turning the vacation home into an Airbnb. My parents informed me that Mark and his wife are getting out of their leases for their SUV and large truck, and they're selling their jet skis and other items they never really needed. This is going to be tough for her. She's quite the show-off and won't enjoy being seen in something older or less expensive. Mark's identity is heavily tied to his truck. He even has a small tattoo of the truck company's logo, which is one of the many reasons we never really connected. Things have taken a drastic turn. I never anticipated anything like this would happen. In short, my brothers-in-law broke into my vacation home and were arrested. They've been charged with breaking and entering, destruction of property, and communicating threats, all Class 1 misdemeanors. I have refused to drop the charges, although I might consider it if I am fully compensated for the damage they caused. As of Saturday evening, they were still in jail, but I assume they're out by now. To summarize the situation, Mark and Jake went to the vacation home, cut through the chain, and damaged the gate. They messed up the front door in their attempts to get in, eventually breaking through another door and then into the barn. David, the caretaker I hired to manage the property, called the police. The officers didn't buy Mark's excuses that they were allowed to be there, especially since I was unreachable at the time, having spent the day with my wife's family and leaving my phone in the car. They were booked at the sheriff's office. My sisters were in a panic, but I had them blocked. The older sister couldn't afford bail because their credit cards were maxed out, so the middle sister had to cover everything. On Friday, my wife and I checked our phones on the way home and found that my parents, the sheriff's department, and David had all tried to reach me. When I got home, I called David to find out the extent of the damage. I ended up calling the sheriff's department that evening to clarify that this was not a misunderstanding and that Mark and Jake did not have my permission to be there. I waited until Saturday afternoon to call my parents. They were both quite shaken, especially my mom. My sisters had pressured them into telling me to drop the charges and claim it was all a mistake. I flatly refused, stating that there was no way I would do that until I spoke with an attorney and was fully compensated for the repairs. By the end of the call, my mom was in tears, which, of course, made me feel terrible. My dad suggested it might be time for a complete reset, but he also believed they needed to pay for the damage. I haven't visited the property yet. I know I'll go crazy when I see the damage in person. The photos I've seen are bad enough. I'm hoping to go tomorrow or Wednesday, but my job doesn't allow me to take time off for non-emergencies. I've left messages with 2 attorney friends, asking for recommendations on the right lawyers to pursue action against my sisters and brothers-in-law. I'm not sure what I can do exactly, but I'm considering seeking restraining orders. I have all the texts they've sent me, which might help. I'm also strongly contemplating suing them for the money they made renting out the place. I don't care about the cash, but it would certainly make them miserable. A couple of side notes: Mark and Jake had no idea I hired someone to keep an eye on the property or that there are now security cameras installed. My parents knew but hadn't told them, understanding it would only escalate the drama. There are signs on the property indicating it's being monitored, along with no trespassing warnings. My wife has reached her limit with all of this. She's been incredibly patient, but now she's made it clear that she believes they all need to learn a hard lesson. While Mark likely won't face any repercussions at work, Jake has a security clearance, so I'm hoping that will motivate him to pay for the damages himself. David, the caretaker, has an interesting background. I knew he was friends with some of the local deputies, but I was unaware that he had been a cop in a big city for years. He was shot on duty and decided to quit, moving to where his parents had retired. He has some PTSD from the experience, and his dog is a certified service animal that is usually with him. I know law enforcement tends to stick together, which is likely how he formed his friend group. On Monday, the agreement I reached with my attorney included what is essentially a civil equivalent of a restraining order. I had already asked my property manager to prepare a bid for the repairs needed, and after our meeting, I called him to get an estimate as soon as possible. By Friday, he estimated that it would cost around $4,000 to fix everything, with most of that amount going toward the front door. On Friday, my attorney contacted my brothers-in-law to inform them of our proposal and advised them to seek their own legal representation. They both agreed to this. The middle brother-in-law mentioned that they could either pay for the damages or hire a lawyer, but not both. They figured that hiring a lawyer wouldn't make a difference since they had no real defense for their actions. His primary concern was whether the charges could be dropped. From what I gathered, they were willing to do anything and sign anything to make this situation go away. My attorney also reached out to the district attorney's office on Friday to discuss the possibility of dismissing the charges. He got the name of the prosecutor and left a message, but he hadn't spoken to them yet. He believes they might dismiss the charges since the brothers-in-law are paying for the damages and have no prior offenses. However, he cautioned me that he's not a criminal lawyer. He advised me to be prepared to drive up there on Monday or Tuesday to tell the prosecutor in person that I wanted everything dismissed. He also emphasized the importance of maintaining no contact with my sisters and brothers-in-law, especially for the next 6 months, and that it would be crucial to adhere to the terms of the agreement regarding future interactions. I suspect the brothers-in-law's change of heart is due to their realization of what's at stake for them, including the potential legal fees and fines. There's also the unlikely possibility that they could face up to 120 days in jail. One of them has a security clearance for his job, which could be jeopardized, so this is their last-ditch effort to preserve their normal lives. While this isn't a perfect resolution, it will at least help me move past the legal and financial turmoil I've been dealing with for the past few months. I doubt I'll ever have a civil relationship with any of them again, and that's perfectly fine with me. What I want most at this point is to close this chapter, move on with my life, and never have to speak to them again. I'm utterly exhausted from this ordeal, and my wife feels the same way. On a side note, receiving the written apology was unexpectedly significant for me. I never thought I would get that, but it turns out it matters to me more than I realized. The money isn't my primary concern right now, but I'll certainly accept it. I'm fairly certain that my middle sister and her husband came up with the funds. The cashier's check is from the credit union associated with his employer. Once everything is signed, I plan to make one final update, likely just an edit to this post. I apologize for being so frantic. Writing these posts has helped me clear my head, and the feedback has been invaluable. I genuinely appreciate everyone's comments, insights, and support, and I sincerely hope none of you ever have to endure this kind of nonsense. In an update on Tuesday morning, I met with my attorney to review the agreement. We made a few minor changes, and he sent it to my sisters and brothers-in-law. The agreement included a requirement that they cover my attorney's fees, which amount to about $3,000. They weren't pleased about that and attempted to negotiate it away, but my attorney firmly told them that they either accepted the terms as they were or we would proceed with suing them for the money they made from renting out the property, the wear and tear from that rental, the repair costs from their break-in, emotional distress, lost income from dealing with this situation, attorney fees, and any other relevant expenses. He also warned them that I would push hard with the district attorney's office to prosecute every charge. In short, they came in and signed the agreement. I wasn't present, but I was informed that the atmosphere was quite tense. The middle brother-in-law seemed to take charge and at one point told both of my sisters to be quiet or he would walk away from the entire deal and make his own arrangement with us, leaving the rest of them to face the consequences. They provided another cashier's check for $2,500, claiming that was all they could manage. It was close enough to the total that we decided to accept it as the final payment. My attorney mentioned that everyone was cold and curt with one another, but they managed to keep it together long enough to sign and left without causing too much of a scene. I drove up to the vacation house early yesterday to assess the damage and meet with the district attorney's office. Seeing the destruction made my blood boil. It was so senseless. To be more reasonable than I initially thought. It's strange how perspective can shift when you're forced to re-evaluate your relationships. Despite the chaos, I've come to realize that not everyone in that family dynamic is entirely to blame for the mess we've found ourselves in. As for my oldest sister and her husband, their financial situation has become quite dire. They'd had their truck repossessed, which must be incredibly embarrassing for them. This was their breaking point. Without the truck, they now have to share a smaller vehicle that my parents loaned them, and it's a tight squeeze with their 3 kids. Financially, they're in a terrible position. They owe at least $125,000, probably more, on high-interest credit cards, and they have zero equity in their house. They also have a couple of personal loans that I suspect they obtained under false pretenses. On top of that, they have loans on their jet skis, ATVs, and trailers, and they owe a significant amount from defaulting on the truck lease. They haven't made any payments on their credit cards or loans in months and are also behind on their house payments. Late last year, they got out of the lease on my sister's massive SUV, but they were upside down on it, meaning they had to come up with cash to do so. They also had to pay an attorney for the fine and court costs related to my brother-in-law's trespassing charge at the vacation house, and they owe my middle sister and her husband money for bail and their share of the damages to the property. My parents have never been financial wizards, but they've generally been responsible. They're retired, their home is paid off, and they live off Social Security and pensions, which together provide more than they spend. They had minimal savings, just an emergency fund, but it turns out they emptied that fund and cashed out a small IRA of $220,000 to help my sister. This allowed her to catch up on her house payments and cover the negative equity on her car lease. Now, however, every bit of savings my parents had is gone. Additionally, my parents have been covering my sister's groceries for several months and continue to pay the insurance on the car they loaned her. According to my dad, my sisters worked on my mom for weeks to convince her to hand over the money. They pressured both of my parents simultaneously for a while, but my dad flatly refused every time. Eventually, my mom caved, worried that my sister would have to move to a small town and that the kids would be left without basic necessities. My dad is understandably upset about the situation, and to say there's some tension between them right now is an understatement. However, I believe they'll be fine in the long run. I was disappointed when my parents shared all of this with me, but I can't say I was surprised. It's frustrating that they emptied their savings to help, but I understand their motivations. Given the bankruptcy laws in our state, by getting caught up on the home loan, my sister should be able to keep the house. I've tried hard not to express my feelings about this, and I've mostly succeeded, but I'm definitely more upset about it than I should be. The worst part for me is that my sister and her husband could now contact my wife and me without any real fear of repercussions. The only penalty in the no-contact agreement is that if they violate it, we can pursue them for the money they made from renting out the vacation house and related damages. However, since they filed for bankruptcy, that's no longer a barrier for them. I'm hoping they'll leave us alone, but who knows? I've also heard that my middle sister and her husband are going through a rough patch, and he's not currently living with her and the kids. I can only guess that he's had enough of the family dynamics that led to this mess. On a brighter note, I've spent 2 weekends at the mountain house since the start of the year, once with my wife and once alone. Both times, there was a lot of snow, and it was incredibly beautiful and relaxing. It felt therapeutic to be there. The place also has good internet service now, thanks to Starlink, which is a nice bonus. Plus, knowing that I can count on David, the property manager, to keep the place in shape and ready for our visits alleviates most of the stress associated with owning it. My parents have used the house a few times as well and get along great with David. In response to relevant comments, I do plan to get a restraining order if they start contacting us again. My wife has made it clear that she expects a very firm approach to any nonsense from them going forward, and I completely agree. I had the security cameras at our house upgraded at the start of the year, just in case they decide to show up. I've also kept all their previous texts to have reached his limit and made some significant changes in his life. I genuinely hope it works out for him and that he can guide my sister in a more positive direction. It's perplexing how my sisters became so entitled. We weren't raised to be like this. Growing up, they weren't any more self-entitled than typical teenagers. We all worked those crummy teenage jobs and didn't get spoiled. It was a standard suburban upbringing. We weren't particularly close, but we weren't enemies either. Somewhere along the line, after going off to college, they changed for the worse. I suppose it could have been worse. They could have become drug addicts or extreme activists, but they certainly evolved into people I no longer want to be around. Yes, the pool incident was the catalyst for the meltdown, but the underlying issues had been building for years. Eventually, the truth about my sister renting out the house on the sly would have come to light, and things would have spiraled out of control just as they did. As for the latest update, there have been numerous requests for one, especially with the 1-year anniversary of the pool incident approaching. My parents worked through the aftermath of my mom giving my oldest sister her IRA and their emergency fund. Altogether, my mom handed over $45,000. Once my dad realized how much my sister had manipulated my mom, he became furious. It was a moment of clarity for my mom as well. They ended up calling my sisters on a three-way call, and according to my dad, it went south quickly. The sisters resorted to gaslighting, and my mom lost her cool, ripping into them hard. There were plenty of tears, and eventually, both sisters hung up. My mom really just wanted them to acknowledge that they had put her and my dad in a precarious financial situation. It was a typical family blow-up, but not the kind of thing that usually happens in our family. The next morning, my dad called my oldest sister and informed her that he would be picking up the car they had loaned her. She tried to argue, but he made it clear that it wasn't up for discussion. He enlisted a neighbor to take him to her house, and as soon as he hung up, he drove it home without speaking to her. She called him afterward and unleashed a torrent of nasty comments, which hurt him, but at least they got the car back. In a shocking revelation, my dad told me that for the last 17 years, they had been giving both sisters a grocery allowance of up to $500 per month. I was taken aback. I thought I had a good grasp of where their money was going, but clearly, I was mistaken. This arrangement began when I was in graduate school and living at home. My sisters requested the money because they thought it was unfair that I was living at home rent-free, and it just never ended. In any case, my parents decided to cut them off. Unsurprisingly, my sisters were not pleased about it. Who gets an allowance from their parents in their 40s? Due to all this, my parents and sisters stopped talking for a while. I'm not sure if they've resolved everything, but they seem to be on speaking terms again, although my parents aren't having them or their kids over. I've adopted a don't ask approach, it's their business. My parents are currently using the vacation home fairly regularly. They're there for a 2-week stay and will likely extend it to 3. Unfortunately, my wife and I haven't spent any time there lately, aside from a couple of day trips I made to check on the place and drop off supplies. David, the property manager I hired, is still taking good care of it. In a side note, my middle sister informed my mom that the oldest sister had been making over $6,000 per month renting out the house, and that had been going on for nearly 3 years. I'm pretty certain she didn't declare that income, which means she was grossing between $8,000 to $9,000 per month. I will forever find it astonishing that my oldest sister and her husband still have their house. My attorney checked up on their bankruptcy case, and the court converted it from Chapter 7 to Chapter 13, which I believe means they have to repay a lot more of their debts. As for my middle sister and her husband, they are still separated. I don't know if my brother-in-law has faced any issues with his security clearance due to the break-in, but I do know he's still with the same large defense company. At my parents' request, I've been working on putting their house into a trust. They want me to manage their affairs as they age and keep the house safe for my sisters. I'm working with an attorney on this, but it's not finalized yet. My parents have asked me to be the trustee and have given me full power of attorney.